We come to the Friday morning segment in our study on great clocks from God. And I'd like to give a little quiz, little pop quiz, as we begin this morning, and let's just see how much you've caught on. First of all, first question, what is the synchrony of the day? Evening to evening. An evening and a morning make a day. But the synchrony, the alignment of the day in God's clocks is from evening to evening. What is the synchrony of the month? New moon to new moon. Excellent. What's the synchrony of God's year? Plus the new moon after the spring equinox, because you start the first month on the new moon after the spring equinox, on or after the spring equinox. So when God actually, I want to impress you with an interesting fact. It is Jesus who is the Creator. Everyone clear on that? In John chapter 1, he makes that very clear. And the Word was God, and the Word was flesh and dwelt among us, and by Him and through Him the world and everything in it was made. John 1:10. He was in the world, and the world was made by Him. And when Jesus, the great engineer, I've used that expression all week long. Jesus is the most amazing engineer. When He put a spin on this planet, how fast did He spin it? 23 hours, 56 minutes, 4 seconds. Very good, Norm. I'm impressed.
But don't ask me to explain that thing you did the other day.
By spinning it at 23 hours, 56 minutes, and 4 seconds, that's precisely the amount of spin necessary so that as we travel in our orbit, the 72 million miles that we'll travel in one day, that angle, that 1 degree almost of arc, is just enough to put the earth right back so that we have sundown to sundown in 24 hours. That is so neat, isn't it? God is so amazing. What is the synchrony of the year? First, new moon, on or after the spring equinox. Spring equinox is the position where the Earth, within its relationship to the sun, you have equal day, equal night. There's 2 equinoxes, one in the spring, one in the fall. There are 2 solstices, one in the summer, one in the winter. Winter solstice is the shortest day of light. Summer solstice is the longest day of light. June 21 and December 21, March 21 and September 22. September 21, depends.
So we can't measure that. We recognize.
No, it's a measured fact. It's a position where astronomers for centuries have used the position of the heavens, a snapshot, and all the angles of the position of the stars is determined from the spring equinox. And so right ascension and the location of things on that date, because they're constantly changing as we move around. And so the point of reference is spring equinox, vernal equinox. March 21. And so if you happen to have a new moon on March 30, the new year, God's new year, would begin on March 30. You pass the spring equinox, first new moon, boom, you start God's year. Everyone, does that make sense to you?
So the new year varies?
In God's clock, yes. Can vary up to 30 days. God's year varies in its length between 354 and 384 days. Let me illustrate that just real quick, just to make sure everybody remembers. from equinox to equinox is exactly 365.24219 days. 365 days and about 6 hours. That's absolute measurement, equinox to equinox. In God's calendar, and the way Jesus set up the observance of Passover, is that Passover would always occur at twilight on the 14th day of the first month. When is the first day then of the first month? When is New Year's Day? The first day that the new moon occurs. The new moon, so if we have a new moon, let's write this down. This is March 21, the spring equinox. What if the first new moon occurs on March 30? Then when will Passover be? Count it out. March 30 would be New Year's Day. That's the day of the new moon. So that's day 1. March 31 would be day 2. I'm using our calendar, the Julian calendar, to calculate the dates. Obviously, in ancient Israel, they would say Nisan 1, Nisan 2, Nisan 3, Nisan 4. And they would simply count off 14 days and then at twilight slay the Passover lamb. And then at midnight on the 15th day, that's when they would eat the Passover lamb. At midnight, because that celebrates at midnight when Jesus flew over Egypt and Jesus killed the firstborn of Egypt. So Jesus set this all up with precision that's impeccable. And so March 30, let's say that is New Year's Day in this example. And then March 31 would be day 2. April 1 would be day 3. April 2 would be day 4. 5, 6, 7, 8. April 7 would be day 9. April 8 would be day 10. April 9 would be day 11, 10, 12, 11, 13, 12, 14. So April 13 would actually be the night on which Passover would be observed. Does everyone see what I just did? Starting with the first new moon on or after the spring equinox. Follow that? Now let me show you how it is possible that in a 19-year cycle, the Jews had 3 years that had 13 months in it instead of 12. Let me show you how that could happen. Watch this. Here is the absolute year, 365.24219. Here's the spring equinox, which would be March 21, let's say. Okay? If a new moon actually happens on the day of the equinox, a new moon is a totally dark moon, but it establishes day 1. You can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Here's the problem. A lunar month is absolutely 29.53 days in length. If you multiply that by 12, you come out with, 6, 10, 18, 19, and then 29, 53, 6, 3, 14, 15, 3. 12 lunar months is a total of 354 days and a third, approximately. 354 days and about 8 hours. But an absolute year is 365. So we are about 11 days short, with 12 lunar months, of getting back to the equinox. So what the Jews would do is that their 12th month is called Adar. A-D-A-R. They would have a 13th month in those years, and they called Adar 2. And what that would mean then is that when the 13th moon occurred, it would be around March 11, about 10 days before the equinox. And so then the next new moon would be around, say, April 8. Let's say, April 9. This would mark day 1 of the new year. And that way, some years had 384 days in it. Some years had 354. It depends on the moon. And keeping up with the moon and keeping up with the sun drove Julius Caesar crazy. And that's why he said, out of here. And he created a calendar that we use today that does not give any respect to the moon. The moon can happen anytime. He disconnected it. This is a solar calendar. And it's synchronized, although Julius Caesar would not admit it. But the proof of it is the fact that in 1582, Pope Gregory XIII had to adjust the calendar because the equinox had moved up to March 10. And it was continuing to creep because of error in having too many leap years. So this calendar really has to synchronize with the equinox on March 21. Julius Caesar said, forget the moon. Just set me up a calendar. And, you know, he thought he was so cool. See, originally when the calendar was established, July had, the 7th month of the year had 30 days. But because he was the great grand poobah of the Roman Empire, he decided to name the 7th month after himself. And July is the derivative of Julius. And he borrowed a day from February to make July 31 days. Well, along comes his brother, or his, I'm not sure, it's not his brother, but his offspring, Augustus. And he said, well, if my brother was so great and so wonderful, I am certainly no less. So he named the 8th month after himself, and we called it Augustus. And he took a day from February to give Augustus 31 days. So February ends up with 28 days. All because of these two guys that had their rule and their reign and their arrogance all around, you know, in the first years of the calendar. It's interesting. It's the Paul Harvey. Now you know the rest of the story. You know, there's a lot of interesting things in history, how things come to be, and we just accept them and never even think a thing about them. And it's just really neat little nuggets that you find that help so much. Okay, so in God's calendar, this presents a problem. Some years have 354 days. Some years have 384 days, depending on the cycle of the moon. And so when we get down to the issue of prophecy, and a time, and a times, and a half a time, what does that equal? Well, how long is a time? How long is a year? Well, we have a problem. We have a small problem here. And the way the ancients solved it was pretty simple, because a time is a reference to one trip around the sun. Remember, or actually the sun went around us in one complete cycle. Back in those days, the earth stood still, and the sun moved. Remember? The ancients concluded that for purposes of calculation, a time would be 360 as in degrees. One complete cycle of the sun. 490s is 360. 360 is the number of degrees, because the sun moves about 1 degree per day in its shift from north to south as we observe it. And then we get to the fall equinox, or to the winter solstice, and the sun begins to return back, and the days begin to get longer. We get to June, and then the sun turns and starts moving the other way, and the days start getting shorter, and the days start getting longer. It's about 1 degree per day. So a time became 360 as in degrees, not days. And if I said, I will see you in one time, that meant I would see you a year from now. One time, 1 year. If I said I would see you in 1 moon, that'd be 1 month from now. So everybody's up to speed now on synchrony. And you know the synchrony of the day, you know the synchrony of the moon, and you know the synchrony of the year. What is the synchrony of the week? The first day of creation. Very good. Boy, I'm amazed at the number of people that have instant recall. And it's still working. The weekly cycle that we observe today is aligned with creation's week. And how do we know that to be true? It's very simple. At the time of creation, God established 7 days. The 7th day was His Sabbath. We jump 2,500 years to the time of the Exodus. God confirms which day of the week is His Sabbath, because what happens on the Sabbath? For 40 years there is no manna. And you know what's funny? This strikes me kind of funny. It may not do this for you, but then again, I'm a little weird. It strikes me kind of funny that before the manna fell, though, everybody knew what day of the week it was. Isn't that interesting? Even before God confirms it, everybody knew what day of the week it was. And in fact, in Exodus 12:41, before the manna begins to fall, at least 2, 3, 4 weeks before the manna begins to fall, the 430 years to the very day, the ancients kept very good records. We know that Noah entered the ark at a very specific time. The Bible tells us the very day and the month and the year. There weren't a bunch of nincompoops. The ancients were very intelligent. You know, you might say it would take a nincompoop to depend on Timex, because I can't read the celestial bodies. See, I've got to read this little thing here. But they could read the celestial bodies. They navigated by it, they understood it, they marked and measured time by it, and they kept very careful track of it. This is why I say, and why I believe, that the genealogical records given in Genesis are highly accurate. Because God gave Moses the information about what took place before the flood. Moses, when he wrote the book of Genesis, he was not an eyewitness to creation. Nobody was. Nobody was there. Nobody saw it. Adam and Eve show up on the 6th day. When God gave this information to Moses and he wrote it down, I believe that God did so that He could give us a tracking of time. And when the Bible says that Adam was 130 years when Seth was born, I believe it. I believe it. What this really means ultimately is that I believe the record as recorded in the Hebrew Pentateuch is a fair and accurate statement of the genealogy from the time of creation to the time of the Exodus. Now, we've covered, this has been a little pop quiz this morning, just to make sure everybody's on track. I want to take you to an interesting text. Give me just a second to locate it here. In the book of Daniel, chapter 4, verse 16, you remember the decree that was put upon Nebuchadnezzar? And why was this decree put on him? Arrogance. Nebuchadnezzar got just a little too big for his britches. That's what we used to say, you know, that's what in the old days. And the Lord said, Nebuchadnezzar, I want you, O king, to understand one important thing. You are only king because I appointed you. It wasn't because you're so hot. It's not because you're so bright. It's not because you are so mighty and big. I chose you. I set you up. But it was Nebuchadnezzar. This is the mind of man. Look what I've done. Look what I've made. Nebuchadnezzar is strutting around like a little vain peacock. And the Lord sends him a warning and says, if you don't calm down here, I'm going to deal with you. Well, Nebuchadnezzar listened to the warning, but he promptly forgot all about it. And about a year later, he was walking around the palace one day, and he got to smarting off and taking all this glory to himself. And immediately, the Bible says, let's see here. Excuse me. The Lord gave him this dream, and in this dream, the Lord was warning him that if he didn't humble himself, that his mind would be changed from that of a man and let him be given the mind of an animal till 7 times pass by for him. 7 times. How long is 7 times, Norm? 7 years. And the decision is announced by messengers. The holy ones declare the verdict so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men, and he gives them to any one he wishes. And he sets over them. We're going to describe George Bush. We're going to describe Bill Clinton. We're going to describe Ronald Reagan, Dwight Eisenhower. We're going to describe the men that God sets up. What does the Bible say? The Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men. And he gives them the kingdoms to anyone he wishes, and he sets over them the lowliest of men. In the King James Version, it says the basest of men. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that every man that God uses is the worst person on earth. But I am saying that God will at times use the worst person on earth. This is what the verse is saying, that he sets... Oh, where do you put Hitler? As the worst person on earth, let's say. Who gave Hitler his throne and his authority and his power? It's a tough question. God did. Hitler was a destroyer. The way I read history in World War II, God raised up Hitler as a destroyer to destroy a number of infrastructures. And those infrastructures, because they were destroyed, has enabled the world to last 50 more years without total disintegration. What I'm trying to say is a hard thing. God raises up people, terrible people. Destroyers are terrible people. And then what does He do to the destroyers? Destroys them. But God raises up destroyers to accomplish His objectives. We may not always understand His objectives until years go by, time goes by. But God raises up destroyers to accomplish His purposes, and then He destroys the destroyer. I'm going to be showing in this tonight's study and tomorrow how that the Antichrist, as I was pointing out last night, the Antichrist comes as a destroyer. And then Jesus comes as the final destroyer. What does He do to Antichrist and all the armies of the earth? Destroys them. The destroyer. Jesus is the ultimate destroyer. And the second coming will not be a Sunday afternoon picnic. It will be a horrific battle in which all the wicked are slain. Billions will lie dead on the face of the earth. That day, the day of the Lord. While I'm thinking about it, we'll come back here, but let me just take you to this text. Look, He is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see Him. Joy, you were talking about that when Jesus comes. Everybody sees Jesus. Every eye will see Him, even those who pierced Him. And all the peoples of the earth will mourn because of Him. Revelation 1:7. We'll go back to Daniel because I want to show you something that's really neat. So the 7 times are decreed upon Nebuchadnezzar. And notice what the Bible says here. That was the dream. And then we'll jump down here to where look at verse 27. Daniel has told the king about his dream, the warning that God has sent to him. And then Daniel says, "Therefore, O king, be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that your prosperity will continue." How tactful of Daniel, right? Be pleased, O king, to stop being a hardhead. Wake up. Well, 12 months later, 12 moons later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, he said to himself, or maybe to a crowd of people, I don't know, "Is not this the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty?" Sounds like the CEO of General Motors. Sounds like the CEO of Microsoft. CEOs have a way of beginning to think that they have built what exists rather than managing what God created. By my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty. The words were still on his lips. Tell me God doesn't hear what we say. The words were still on his lips when a voice came from heaven. "This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like cattle. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes." And look at the next verse. How do you interpret verse 33? What does that word mean? Right now. Immediately. Immediately. The words are on his lips. Boom. Immediately, what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. Tell me God doesn't hear what's going on in this planet. He was driven away from people, and he ate grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle, and his nails were like the claws of a bird. At the end of that time, the 7 times Nebuchadnezzar writing this says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. John, that's exactly what you were saying yesterday. God does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, what have you done? At the same time that my sanity was restored, my honor and splendor were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. But this was a humble Nebuchadnezzar. Certainly not. I've never said that.
I've said he uses force.
Yes. God will use whatever it takes. He used force on Pharaoh. God used force on Israel through Nebuchadnezzar. God uses whatever it takes to meet the objectives. But in everything he does, it's righteous. It's righteous and right and justifiable. Everybody okay? Now, I want to show you something. Really, what this little story is all about. Go back to verse 32. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals, and you will eat grass like cattle. 7 times. Now, you have told me this morning that you believe that a year begins when? First new moon on or after the spring equinox. So what would you say about the 7 times? When would it begin? When does a year begin? 7 times is 7 years, right? So when would it begin? In the spring of the year. Right? God's calendar. And who's imposing the sentence? The creator of time. Who decides 7 times? The creator of time. Who uses the language 7 times? The creator of time. 7 times is 1 week of years in the Jubilee calendar. Would you be surprised to find out? Look at this overhead here. Well, you can't read this, can you? Let me zoom in a little more and see if we can't make this a little easier to read. Yes, Bob, just turn off the middle section there, please. Very good. That makes that a little easier to read. This is a little chart. On my website, I have an article titled Great Clocks from God. And this is a little chart that's on the website, and I've just printed it off here to show you something. If the Sunday year of the Exodus is 1437, the Monday year would be 1436, the Tuesday year would be 1435, the Wednesday year would be 1434, and so on. You remember the synchrony. We've been talking about this all week long. The 7 times of Nebuchadnezzar happened to occur from 569 to 563 BC. And that just happens to be a Sunday through Sabbath week. Isn't that amazing?
How do you establish the 0?
How did I establish what?
The 0.
The 0.
The Sunday.
Well, if you know that 1437 is a Sunday year, you can calculate all Sunday years forward and backward. See, once you know where, remember, yesterday morning I explained that because Jesus dies in the middle of the 70th week, then that's a Wednesday year. Once you know the Wednesday year and the Sunday year, you can calculate them all, forward and backward. Once you know the alignment of one thing, you can calculate the alignment of all things, of all years and weeks. It's the same issue here. If your payday occurs on Friday, every other Friday, and you know that you had a payday on January 7 of the year 2000, you can calculate all paydays forward and backward for years, as many years, 1,000 years if you want to, because of the synchrony of the calendar, the repetition of the calendar. Norm, let me give you a little test now. If your payday was on January 7, 2000, and you get paid every 2 weeks, what would be the payday of your third payday? This is your first.
It would be the fourth day of February.
Fourth. Let's see. He said the 4th day of February. He said that before I flipped the page. Did you notice? How did he know?
It's gotten off the spaces.
But you see what I'm saying. Once you know the synchrony of one date, everything forward and backward lines with it. Everything, you can't move it. It's all locked down. It's airtight. So when God put 7 times over Nebuchadnezzar, and if you'll go back and study what's known in ancient history about Nebuchadnezzar, we find that he finished his conquests. He finished his conquests around 572, 571. He's returned home from all of his military escapades here in the sabbatical year. And the reason that I was pointing out immediately upon saying those words, this was executed, it must have been on or about the first day of the first month of the Sunday year 569, and the 7 times occur here. The week of 7 years is here, and then Nebuchadnezzar dies in 561 BC. So his sanity returns, he returns to his throne, and a humbled, and I hope a redeemed Nebuchadnezzar dies in 561 BC. Neat story, huh? Well, the reason that I've boggled your mind with this morning is that I want you to understand an even larger fact, an even larger and more amazing fact about God's synchrony of timing. When he said that the little horn power would persecute the saints a time, times, and half a time in Daniel 7, knowing what you now know, what would you expect about the commencement of the persecution of God's people? What would you say about the commencement of the time? It'd be in the spring of the year, and it would be a Sunday year. If you'll go to your Jubilee chart and look at 538, you will find that is precisely the case. And the time, times, and half a time of the 1260 years begin in a Sunday year and complete in a Sabbath year 1,260 years later. Whoa.
So you expect the persecution to start again on the Sunday year?
No. The Jubilee calendar is finished. There are no more Sunday years. This is over. This is finished. The great week has been closed. It's over.
As far as the Jubilee calendar is concerned, the time still moves.
But when this calendar finishes, we move to a larger calendar. We're moving to a larger calendar.
That calendar, the Jubilee, is inside.
This calendar is like the month within the year. This is like the month within the year. This is only a piece of the bigger picture. This thing is over. This month is finished. And so now we move to a larger calendar. The thing I want to show you here, just before we take our intermission, this is the what I call the Grand Week. That term is not in the Bible. I just made it up. I call the Jubilee calendar the Great Week. That term is not in the Bible. I just made it up. Because I need some way to differentiate these things so that I can explain them to you. So teachers have the prerogative of using their imagination to make up whatever they need. That's the fifth rule of interpretation. The Grand Week is 7,000 years. This calendar, this clock, has been ticking ever since the day sin began. And I have plotted on here, according to Scripture, the record of the genealogies from Adam down to Noah. That's 1,656 years. And then from Noah, he's 600 years old when the flood occurs. And here's the flood. And then we know where the Exodus is. And then we know about the 430 years in Egypt. That's what the green area is. And then we work our way back from the time of Moses to his father Amram, to his father Kohath, to his father Levi. Levi's father is Jacob, and then from Jacob to Isaac, and from Isaac back to Abraham. We can just work our way right back and forward. And then this blue area represents the Great Week, the Jubilee calendar. And then this kind of a light color red represents the sabbatical millennium, the 1,000 years. And the little white space down here represents just a handful of years that's necessary to bring this all to completion. Does that make sense to you? Now, before we take the intermission, here's the last statement. When I was reading Revelation years ago, and I noticed that the 1,000 years, I said to myself, why did God choose 1,000 years for that? The 1,000 years that the saints are reigning with Christ, and the earth is desolate, and the earth is receiving its rest. Why did God make it? Why did He make it 420 or 430 years? Why didn't He make it 100 years? Why did He make it 1,000? That's a long time. Was it Methuselah that almost made it? Methuselah lived 969 years. Almost this whole one period of time. Well, the thought went through my mind. I wonder if He used 1,000 years here because there are other 1,000-year units. So I got out my pencil, went to work, working my way back and forward, and I discovered, hey, the Bible in its entirety only covers 7,000 years. I thought, wow, this must be a valid unit of time. The same thing happened to me when I came to understand the Jubilee chart, the Jubilee calendar. When I look at the 70 weeks of Daniel 9, I got to thinking, I wonder if that 490 years, if there are other units just like it. And lo and behold, I find there are 7. God is an amazing engineer, and after we come back from the break, I'm going to show you that even though man may be ignorant of God's synchrony, It doesn't change God's use of His synchrony. Let's take a break and then we'll continue.